They dimmed every light in the chamber before I walked in, and it still was not enough. The glow pouring off my skin filled the room like a second sun, pale blue and relentless, casting shadows behind the 7 members of the Strategic Directorate who sat in their curved seats and tried very hard not to stare. They failed. Every single one of them failed, and I watched their translucent faces shift from professional composure to something that looked a great deal like fear. I had been a tactical cataloger for 19 cycles. I had embedded with 14 species across 6 active conflicts. I had observed the Keldrothi burn colony ships in the Marin Expanse, and the Dreth swarm fleets tear apart a defense line above Sethkai Prime. My body, by professional necessity, had remained almost entirely unmarked. A cataloger who scarred easily was a cataloger who could not be trusted to remain objective. Emotional extremes leave bioluminescent marks on Veshtari's skin, and mine had carried perhaps 3 faint traces before this assignment. 3 pale scratches of light across 2 decades of watching other species try to destroy each other. Now there was not enough skin left to hold what I had brought back. The scars covered my forearms in dense, overlapping rivers of luminescence. They climbed my neck in sharp, branching lines. They crossed my face in patterns that looked like fractures in glass. My hands glowed so brightly that the aide who had escorted me to the chamber had walked 3 steps behind me the entire way, shielding her eyes. Director Halvin leaned forward from the center seat and activated the recording device on the table. Her voice was careful and controlled. The way you speak to someone who has come back from a place you did not expect them to return from. Senior Cataloger Sol, you were dispatched 14 standard rotations ago to observe human military operations in the Calyx margin. Your preliminary report indicated a recommendation for immediate reclassification of human combat capability. This hearing has been convened to receive your full assessment. She paused. Her eyes traced the scars along my jaw. Please begin. I looked at the panel. I looked at their unmarked skin, their composed expressions, their expectation that I would deliver data in the neat, clinical format they were accustomed to receiving. Engagement parameters, weapons analysis, fleet composition, doctrinal assessment, all the sterile vocabulary we use to describe the act of killing from a safe analytical distance. You sent me to observe, I said. Let me tell you what observation costs. The assignment had arrived on a quiet morning, delivered to my quarters aboard the Veshtari diplomatic station at Koreth. A single-page briefing with a species designation I had to look up. Humans. Terran Confederacy. Mid-range territorial holding in an unremarkable sector. Technological capability rated at Tier 6, which placed them roughly in the middle of the Galactic Development Index. Notable for nothing in particular. The briefing described their military as compact, conventionally equipped, and recently deployed to the Calyx margin under a peacekeeping mandate that none of the warring parties had requested. I remember reading that briefing and feeling a quiet, professional insult. 14 species, 6 conflicts. The Keldrothi campaigns alone had earned me a commendation from the Directorate for exceptional analytical contribution, and now they were sending me to watch a Tier 6 species play peacekeeper in a border skirmish that barely registered on the Galactic Threat Index. I packed light. I expected to be back within 6 rotations. The human carrier was called the Carthage, and it was the loudest military vessel I had ever set foot on. I had embedded with species that communicated through subsonic vibrations, and species that fought in absolute silence, and species whose ships hummed with the low drone of collective neural harmonics. The Carthage sounded like a market district during a festival. Music echoed from open compartment doors. Crew members shouted across corridors to each other, not in alarm but in greeting, in mockery, in laughter. Someone somewhere was singing, badly, and someone else was telling them to stop, and a third voice was encouraging them to sing louder. I stood in the docking bay with my equipment cases, and my professional composure, and my nearly unmarked skin, and wondered if I had boarded the wrong ship. My liaison officer found me before I found her. Lieutenant Kess Morrow was shorter than I expected humans to be, built close to the ground with dense muscle, and quick, sharp eyes that seemed to be constantly measuring distances. She had a scar that ran from her left ear to the corner of her mouth, and when I noted it with the automatic clinical reflex of my training, she caught me looking and grinned. Blade fight on Corvus Station, she said, as though I had asked. 3 years ago, the other guy looks worse. She picked up one of my equipment cases before I could object, tucked it under her arm as though it weighed nothing, and started walking. I followed, cataloging as I went. Corridor width, crew density, equipment placement, the dozen small observations that would eventually form the skeleton of my report. 3 rules, Kess said over her shoulder, as she led me through a maze of corridors that all looked identical. Stay behind whatever line someone tells you is the line. Wear the armor we give you, even if it does not fit, which it won't. And if somebody grabs you and starts running, you run first and ask questions after. I have embedded with 14 combat forces across 6 active conflicts, I told her. I am familiar with operational protocols. She glanced back at me. The grin had not left her face, but something behind it shifted, just for a moment, into an expression I could not immediately classify. Sure, she said, but you have not embedded with us. The mess hall was my first real study environment, and it confused me immediately. I had observed soldiers from more species than most analysts ever encounter, and the pattern was always recognizable, regardless of biology. Soldiers in a combat deployment exist in a state of managed anxiety. They eat quickly or not at all. They speak in low voices. They check weapons and equipment with repetitive, compulsive precision. Fear is the baseline atmosphere aboard any warship heading toward a fight, and every species handles it in roughly the same way, by trying to control the few things that can be controlled. The humans were not afraid. I need to be precise about this, because the distinction matters. I had observed species that masked their fear with discipline, and species that suppressed their fear with chemical regulation, and species that channeled their fear into ritualistic aggression that looked like confidence from a distance, but collapsed under pressure. I knew what managed fear looked like in 14 different biological configurations, and I could identify it the way a doctor identifies a fever, by the small, involuntary signs that training cannot fully conceal. The humans were not managing fear. They were not suppressing it, or masking it, or channeling it. They were simply not experiencing it at a level that registered as operationally significant. They treated the fact that they were heading into combat the way most civilians treat the fact that it might rain later, a minor atmospheric condition that required appropriate preparation and nothing more. I sat in the mess hall with a tray of food I could not identify and watched 200 soldiers eat and talk and argue about things that had nothing to do with the deployment. A group near the far wall was engaged in a heated debate about whether some form of organized sport had produced a legitimate championship result. A pair of engineers were sketching something on a napkin, arguing over structural specifications with the intensity most species reserve for battle planning. Kess sat across from me, eating steadily, and explained the food when I asked, and the deployment when I did not ask, filling silences with a casual stream of information that felt less like a briefing and more like a conversation. The calyx margin has been a mess for about 4 years, she said between bites of something she called pasta. 3 species fighting over mining rights in a corridor, none of them can hold long enough to actually mine. Civilian casualties running high, station populations getting caught in crossfire. The Confederacy decided to step in. Your government was invited to intervene? I asked. No. A treaty obligation? No. A strategic interest? Resource claim? Territorial buffer? Kess shook her head to each question, chewing calmly. People were dying. We showed up. I noted this in my mental log as culturally significant, but likely exaggerated. Every species frames its military interventions in noble terms. The reality is always strategic interest, resource acquisition, or territorial expansion, wearing a humanitarian mask. I had seen this pattern 14 times before. My first scar appeared that evening. I was standing in the observation deck, watching the stars slide past as the Carthage accelerated toward the calyx margin, and I felt the familiar warm tingle of bioluminescent activation along my left wrist. I pushed back my sleeve and looked down. A thin line of pale blue light traced across my inner forearm, faint but unmistakable. The mark of an emotional extreme recorded in living tissue. I had not been frightened. I had not been in danger. I had been sitting in a mess hall watching soldiers laugh. I examined the scar for a long time, turning my wrist under the starlight, trying to identify what had triggered it. The Veshtori bioluminescent response is well documented. Physical trauma, fear, grief, rage, and on rare occasions, profound awe. I had experienced none of these. I had simply been watching humans exist in a state that defied every behavioral model I had spent my career constructing. I dismissed it. A minor anomaly. A statistical outlier in an otherwise unremarkable physiological history. The deployment briefing came the following morning. I sat at the back of the operations room alongside Kess and watched Captain Luca Dane address his officers. Dane was tall for a human, lean and quiet, with the kind of stillness that I had learned to associate with competence in every species I had observed. He spoke without raising his voice, and the room listened with an attention that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with trust. The situation was straightforward and terrible. A Dreth warlord named Kesavax had consolidated a raiding fleet in the Thresh Corridor, the narrowest and most strategically significant passage through the Calyx margin. The Dreth were an insectoid species, aggressive and numerous, and Kesavax had been bombarding civilian stations belonging to the Sethkai, a small amphibian species with no military capability worth mentioning. The Sethkai were dying in significant numbers. The other warring factions were content to let it happen, since the Dreth were doing their territorial work for them. Captain Dane laid out the tactical picture with the kind of plain, undecorated language that I respected professionally. The Dreth fleet in the Thresh Corridor outnumbered the human battle group roughly 4-1. The Dreth held positional advantage, fortified emplacements, and intimate knowledge of the corridor's navigational hazards. The human battle group had the Carthage, 3 escort frigates, 2 light cruisers, and a single destroyer. I began calculating odds. Defensive positioning at the corridor entrance. Long-range engagement to equalize the numerical disadvantage. Probe attacks to test Dreth response patterns before committing to a full engagement. These were the standard options that any competent military force would consider. "We go in at full speed," Dane said. "Combat formation Bravo. Close to engagement range inside the first 4 minutes. All ships weapons free on my mark." I looked at Kess. She was watching Dane with the same calm focus as everyone else in the room. No one objected. No one asked clarifying questions. No one suggested that charging directly into a force 4 times their size through a narrow corridor might be a profoundly terrible idea. "Captain," I said quietly to Kess, "your fleet is outnumbered 4-1. Closer to 5 if the reserve screen joins in," she said. "And the plan is a direct frontal assault." She leaned over, close enough that I could see the detail of the scar along her jaw, and said with the kind of casual certainty that made the second mark appear on my skin before she had even finished the sentence. "You might want to eat something. It is going to be a long night." The Thresh Corridor was a gravitational nightmare. Dense asteroid fields flanked a narrow channel of navigable space that twisted through a region of competing stellar masses, and the Dreth had fortified every viable position along its length. Weapons platforms clung to asteroid surfaces like parasites. Patrol ships moved in layered screens, sweeping the approach vectors in overlapping patterns that left no blind spots. Behind them, the main fleet waited in a defensive formation that exploited every navigational choke point the corridor offered. I stood in the combat information center of the Carthage and watched the tactical display paint a picture that any competent military analyst would describe as suicide. The Dreth outnumbered us. They outgunned us. They held the terrain. Every variable favored them. Captain Dane stood at the central console, hands clasped behind his back, watching the same display I was watching. If the numbers concerned him, his body betrayed nothing. Around him, the CIC crew worked their stations with an efficiency that bordered on mechanical. Voices steady, movements precise. The low murmur of coordinated professionals preparing to do something that should not have been possible. "All ships, combat formation Bravo, accelerate to attack speed." The Carthage surged forward, and the corridor swallowed us. The first Dreth volley hit at extreme range, a probing barrage designed to test our defenses and force a deceleration. Standard doctrine. Every species I had observed responded to a probing barrage in the same way. Shield reinforcement, course adjustment, speed reduction to assess the threat before committing. The engagement, would then settle into a careful, measured exchange of fire at optimal range, each side testing the other, looking for weakness, minimizing risk. The Carthage did not slow down, neither did the escorts flanking her. The formation punched through the first volley with shields rotating in a coordinated sequence that distributed incoming fire across the entire group, each ship absorbing its share for precisely 3 seconds before handing off to the next in line. The technique was unlike anything in my reference files. It treated the fleet not as individual vessels, but as a single organism with a shared skin. Close to knife range, Dane said. His voice had not changed. All batteries prepare for continuous fire. Knife range. I learned later that humans used this term to describe engagement distances so close that weapons accuracy became essentially perfect for both sides, where numerical advantage collapsed, because you could only bring a fraction of your force to bear in the compressed space, where the fight became a brutal point-blank exchange that rewarded aggression over calculation. It was a range that every tactical manual I had ever studied explicitly warned against. Every species I had cataloged maintained doctrinal minimums for engagement distance precisely because closing to this range transformed a battle from a solvable equation into a contest of will, and will was the one variable that humans had decided to make their primary weapon. The Dreth did not expect us to close. Their formation was optimized for a ranged engagement. Layered screens designed to create overlapping fields of fire that would shred an approaching fleet long before it reached effective striking distance. When the human ships burst through their outer screen at full acceleration and began firing at ranges so close that the Dreth gunners could not track fast enough to compensate, the mathematical advantage evaporated. I watched the tactical display and felt my skin burning. The Carthage's batteries fired in a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat, steady and relentless, each salvo precisely targeted to strip shields from the nearest Dreth vessel before shifting to the next. The escorts worked the flanks, darting through gaps in the Dreth formation with a reckless precision that defied every tactical principle I had cataloged across 14 species. They were not fighting cautiously. They were not managing risk. They were attacking with a focused, controlled ferocity that treated the numerical disadvantage as an inconvenience rather than a death sentence. A Dreth destroyer broke through the screen and lined up a torpedo run on the Carthage's port side. Before I could call out the threat, the cruiser Andover threw herself into the gap, taking the torpedo spread across her forward shields. The impact staggered her visibly on the display, but she held position and returned fire with everything she had, crippling the Dreth destroyer before it could reload. No one in CIC reacted as though this were unusual. An ensign at the sensor station called out damage reports in a tone that might have been reading a grocery list. A lieutenant adjusted shield frequencies without looking up from her console. Someone in the back row was eating a sandwich. A sandwich. I looked down at my arms. 3 new scars blazed across my forearm, bright lines of blue-white light that pulsed with each heartbeat. A 4th was forming across my collarbone, spreading like a crack in ice. I had accumulated more marks in 20 minutes than in my previous 19 cycles of service. The battle lasted 3 hours. When it was over, the Dreth fleet in the Thresh corridor had been reduced by 60%. The remainder had scattered into the asteroid fields, combat ineffective and running. The human battle group had taken damage across every ship, but had not lost a single vessel. I sat in the CIC long after the all-clear had sounded, staring at the after-action display, and trying to reconcile what I had just witnessed with every tactical model I had ever constructed. The models did not account for this. They could not account for an enemy that treated disadvantage as an invitation, that closed distance when every rational calculation demanded retreat, that fought with a precision and aggression that seemed to operate on fundamentals my training had never considered. Kess found me there, still staring. She had a cut above her eye from a console fragment that had broken loose during the Andover's torpedo interception, and she had not bothered to have it treated. "You look like you have questions," she said. "Why did you charge?" I asked. "You were outnumbered. You had no positional advantage. Every tactical doctrine I have studied across every species I have observed would have recommended a defensive engagement at the corridor entrance." Kess pulled a chair over and sat down across from me. She was quiet for a moment, which I was beginning to learn was unusual for her. "How many species have you watched fight?" she asked. 14. And how many of them started a battle by trying to survive it? I opened my mouth and closed it again. The answer was all of them. Every species I had observed, without exception, built their combat doctrine around the fundamental assumption that the primary objective was to survive the engagement. Every tactic, every formation, every strategic calculation ultimately served the goal of preserving your own forces while reducing the enemy's. Every one of them, I said. Kess nodded. That is the difference. Every species you have watched builds their tactics around the assumption that their enemy wants to live. And they are right, because almost every species does. The Dreth want to live. The Keldrathi want to live. The Vorshan, the Nethic. Every species you have catalogued fights with one eye on the exit. She leaned forward. We do not. That is irrational. That is why it works. You build your defense to stop an enemy who is trying to survive. You do not build it to stop an enemy who has already accepted that survival is secondary to victory. When we closed distance, every Dreth in that fleet had to recalculate. Every gun crew had to adjust. Every commander had to decide whether the things coming at them at full speed were bluffing. And by the time they decided we were not, we were already too close for their formation to matter. She said it without bravado, without pride. She was explaining a mechanical principle, the way an engineer might explain why a bridge can bear weight. This was not recklessness. It was not madness. It was a deliberate, calculated exploitation of the one variable that no other species had learned to weaponize: the willingness to die. I looked down at my new scars, glowing steadily in the dimmed light of the CIC. I need to examine the ground situation, I said, because I did not know what else to say. We deploy in 4 hours, Kess said. The station that was being bombarded. We are going in to assess civilian casualties and secure the area. The station was called Sethkai Holding 7, and what I saw inside it will remain in my skin for the rest of my life. The Dreth bombardment had been methodical and indiscriminate. Hull breaches across 6 decks, atmosphere venting in sections that had been sealed too late to save the people inside. Emergency lighting flickered in corridors that were littered with debris and with the small, still bodies of the Sethkai, an amphibian species barely a meter tall, with wide, dark eyes and delicate, webbed hands. I had seen the aftermath of military action before. The Keldrathi campaigns had produced civilian casualties on an industrial scale, and I had walked through those killing fields with professional detachment, cataloging damage patterns and weapon signatures, and the grim arithmetic of collateral destruction. My skin had remained unmarked. War produces dead civilians. It is a variable in the equation, not an emotional event. The humans did not treat it as a variable. I watched a squad of human soldiers move through the ruined corridors, clearing compartments and checking for survivors, and what I saw in their faces was not the professional detachment I had observed in every other military force. It was not the grim acceptance of inevitable loss. It was not the careful emotional distance that allows soldiers to function in the presence of mass death. It was anger. Not the hot, explosive anger of rage. Something colder. Something that settled into their jaws and their shoulders, and the way they held their weapons. A corporal named Eddie Grant knelt beside the body of a Sethkai child whose dark eyes were still open, and he stayed there for a long time. When he stood up, he looked at the child and said, in a voice that was barely audible, "We are going to find who did this, I promise you." He was making a promise to a dead child who was not human, not a citizen of his nation, not a member of his species. A child whose existence held no strategic value, whose death would change no calculation, whose name the corporal would never know. I felt the scar form across my sternum, like a line drawn in fire. Kess stood beside me as the squad continued its sweep. She watched Grant's promise without surprise or commentary, as though this was something she had seen before, something so ordinary in human military culture that it did not require acknowledgement. "Why does he care?" I asked her. The question sounded clinical when I said it, but it was not clinical. I was asking because I genuinely did not understand. These are not your people. The Sethkai are not your allies. There is no strategic benefit to emotional investment in their casualties. Kess looked at me, and for the first time since I had met her, there was no grin on her face. just a quiet, steady seriousness that made the light under my skin pulse brighter. "Because they are dead," she said, "and we are here. What other reason do you need?" I caught my own reflection in a darkened viewport as we returned to the Carthage. The new scars were glowing brighter than any I had ever received. Not the dull, faded traces that come from proximity to danger, which I knew well. Not the sharp flares that come from fear or physical trauma, which I had experienced in controlled doses during training. These were something else entirely. They radiated with a steady, deep luminescence that seemed to come from somewhere inside the bone, and they were spreading. I pressed my hand against the viewport and watched my own light reflect back at me from the dark glass, and I realized that I did not have a clinical term for what was happening. The Veshtari bioluminescent response has been studied for centuries. The taxonomy is precise. Fear produces sharp, narrow marks. Pain produces diffuse spreading marks. Grief produces deep, slow marks that darken over time. What was growing across my skin did not match any category. It was too bright for grief, too steady for fear, too widespread for pain. I stood in that corridor and searched my professional vocabulary for a classification that fit, and I found nothing. It would take me several more days to understand that what my body was recording was something the Veshtari had so rarely experienced that we had never bothered to build a word for it. I was in the presence of something that exceeded what my species had been built to comprehend. And my skin, that honest and merciless record keeper, was documenting every moment of it whether I wanted it to or not. I returned to my quarters and began drafting my preliminary assessment. My hands were steady, my language was precise. I wrote about fleet composition and engagement doctrine and tactical innovation, and I did not mention the scars, and I did not mention the dead Sethkai child, and I did not mention the corporal's promise, and I did not mention the sandwich. But the light bleeding through my sleeves painted the walls of my cabin in pale blue, and no amount of professional detachment could turn it off. The campaign pushed deeper into the Thresh corridor over the next 5 days, and I stopped trying to control what was happening to my skin. There was no point. Every engagement added new marks, and the engagements came daily, sometimes twice, as the human battle group systematically dismantled the Dreth presence in the corridor and secured evacuation routes for the Sethkai civilian population. I embedded with a ground platoon on the 4th day. Standard observation protocol. I had done this dozens of times with other species, walking behind their soldiers into cleared zones and recently secured positions, observing small unit tactics and infantry doctrine from a safe analytical distance. The platoon was commanded by a staff sergeant named Dara Okafor, a compact woman with steady hands and a voice that carried without ever rising above a conversational tone. She briefed me the same way Kess had briefed me, with the same casual assumption that I was intelligent enough to follow instructions and fragile enough to need them. Stay behind Corporal Liu. If Liu moves, you move. If Liu drops, you drop. If Liu tells you to run, you do not ask where. Corporal Fen Liu was 23 years old, which I had learned was young even by human standards. And he carried himself with the quiet competence of someone who had decided long ago that fear was a luxury he could not afford. He nodded to me once when Okafor assigned him as my escort, checked his weapon, and said nothing else. The target was a Dreth supply depot built into the superstructure of an abandoned mining platform. Intelligence indicated light resistance. Intelligence was wrong. The first indication that the depot was more heavily defended than expected came when the point team triggered a concealed sensor grid 50 meters from the main entrance. The Dreth counterattack was immediate and overwhelming. They poured from concealed positions in the superstructure like water through a broken dam, dozens of armored bodies moving with the terrifying coordination of a hive species that communicates through chemical signals rather than language. I had studied the Dreth from a theoretical perspective. I had read engagement reports and casualty analyses and weapons assessments. Nothing I had read prepared me for the reality of Dreth infantry at close range. They were massive. Armored exoskeletons covered their bodies in interlocking plates that deflected standard caliber weapons fire. Mandible blades extended from their jaws, each one as long as my forearm, capable of shearing through light armor plating. Their acid spit glands could project a corrosive spray accurate to 15 meters that dissolved organic and inorganic material with equal efficiency. Every species I had observed treated Dreth ground forces as a worst-case combat scenario. The standard galactic doctrine was explicit and universal. Engage at range, maintain distance, retreat immediately if they close to melee. Never, under any circumstances, enter a structure they have fortified. The humans breached the structure in teams of 4. I followed Liu through a secondary entry point, pressed against the wall behind him, my datapad clutched against my chest, my scars already beginning to pulse with new light. Inside the depot, the corridors were narrow and poorly lit, designed for Dreth physiology, which meant they were too low for most humans to stand upright. The platoon moved in a hunched, rapid advance that required constant physical discomfort, and none of them complained. None of them hesitated. They communicated in hand signals, each gesture precise and immediately understood, covering angles and clearing corners with a reflexive coordination that looked less like training and more like a shared nervous system. The Dreth hit us at the second junction, a swarm rush from a concealed compartment, 8 of them pouring through a doorway that should have held 4, mandible blades extended, acid glands primed. The sound they made was a high, chittering shriek that vibrated in my chest cavity and activated every prey response instinct my biology possessed. I dropped flat. Liu dropped beside me, weapon up, already firing. Ahead of us, the lead fire team held the junction. 3 soldiers in a corridor, barely wide enough for 2, weapons braced against walls and door frames, pouring fire into the charging mass of chitin and blade. The Dreth crashed against them like a wave against a seawall, and the seawall held. I counted the seconds. I could not help it. The professional reflex overrode everything else, and I counted, because that was what I did. 11 minutes. 3 human soldiers held that corridor against repeated Dreth charges for 11 minutes, while Okafor led the rest of the platoon through a maintenance shaft to flank the defenders. 11 minutes of continuous, close-quarters combat, in a space so confined that the acid spray from Dreth glands spattered the walls in hissing, smoking trails that ate through the metal. Private Oso Kalu was on the left side of the line. He was the largest soldier in the platoon, broad-shouldered and calm in a way that seemed geological, as though panic was something that happened to other people in other places. During the 7th minute, a Dreth breacher got close enough to spit a concentrated acid stream that hit Kalu across the right shoulder. The acid dissolved through his armor plating in seconds, reaching the skin beneath, and I saw the flesh beneath blister and smoke. I expected him to fall. I expected the scream, the collapse, the desperate scramble backward that every species exhibits when confronted with the kind of pain that dissolves rational thought. I had seen Keldrathi warriors, beings bred for combat across 3,000 generations, buckle under less. Kalu swore once. A single, sharp word that I later learned was considered profane even by human standards. He shifted his weapon from his right hand to his left, braced it against the wall with his uninjured arm, and continued firing. His shots did not lose accuracy. His position did not shift. The acid continued to eat through his shoulder, sending thin curls of chemical smoke into the corridor air, and I could smell the acrid burn of dissolving tissue, and I could see the muscles in his jaw clenched so tightly that the tendons in his neck stood out like cables. But he continued to fight as though it were a minor inconvenience, a thing to be dealt with later, after the more important business of killing everything in the corridor was finished. The soldier beside him glanced at the wound once, then looked away, not out of disgust but out of trust. She trusted Kalu to say something if he needed help. Kalu did not say anything. He kept firing. The flanking team hit the Dreth from behind 4 minutes later, and the junction was secured. Kalu sat down against the wall, looked at the ruin of his shoulder, and said to the medic who rushed to him, "It is fine. It just stings a little." My entire left forearm was incandescent. I could barely hold my datapad. The scars were forming so rapidly that I could feel each one individually, thin lines of fire tracing across my skin in real time, recording what I was witnessing in the only language my body understood. I sat in a cleared compartment after the depot was secured, and I tried to write my observations in coherent clinical language, and my hands were shaking too badly to type. Lou sat beside me, cleaning his weapon with practiced automatic movements, and glanced over. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No. Your skin is doing something." "I know." He looked at the light pouring from my forearms, the dense constellation of scars that had doubled in the past hour, and he said, with the same understated simplicity that seemed to be a defining characteristic of every human I had met, "Looks kind of beautiful, actually." That night, after the depot was fully secured and the platoon had established a perimeter, I sat with Kess on the outer hull of the mining platform. The stars were dense and cold above the calyx margin, and the light from my scars reflected off Kess's face as she sat beside me, close enough that I could see the fatigue in her eyes and the dried blood from a cut she had received during the assault and had not yet mentioned. "I need to ask you something," I said, "not for my report, for myself." She waited. "Why do you do this?" She did not ask me to clarify. She knew I was not asking about the tactical decisions or the force composition or the strategic calculations. I was asking the question that had been growing inside me since the mess hall on the Carthage, since the dead Sethkai child, since Kalu's shoulder, since the corridor. "All of it," I said. "You are not the strongest species. You are not the fastest. Your technology is competent but unremarkable. You are not defending your own territory, and you are not fulfilling a treaty obligation, and there is no resource in this corridor worth the casualties you are taking. Why are you here?" Kess was quiet for a long time. The stars moved slowly overhead, and the distant rumble of the Carthage's engines reached us through the platform's hull like a pulse. "There is a concept," she said eventually. "Humans call it bearing witness. It means that if you see something happening, you become part of it. Not because you chose to be, not because you asked, because you saw it, and seeing it made you responsible." Responsible for what? For doing something about it. We believe that if you see suffering, and you have the ability to act, and you choose to walk away, then the suffering becomes partly yours, that you carry it with you, that it marks you. I looked down at my arms, luminous with the evidence of everything I had seen, and said nothing. "The Sethkai are dying," Kess continued. "We did not start the war that is killing them, and we cannot end all the wars that will come after this one, but we can be here, in this corridor, right now, and we can make the dying stop in this one place. And that is enough. That has to be enough, because the alternative is to know that people are dying, and to decide that it is not your problem." She turned to look at me, and her eyes were steady, and her voice had not wavered, and the scar along her jaw caught the light from my skin and cast a thin shadow across her cheek. "Humans fight other people's battles, because not fighting is worse than dying, Revan. Walking away from someone else's war is its own kind of wound. And we have decided, as a species, that there are wounds we refuse to carry." I sat with that statement for a long time after she left. The scars on my body pulsed gently, each one a record of a moment that had exceeded what my nervous system was designed to process. And I understood, finally, what was happening to me. The marks I was accumulating were not from fear, they were not from shock or pain or danger. They were from awe. The Veshtari body records emotional extremes. In 19 cycles of service, across 14 species and 6 conflicts, nothing had ever awed me. I had been frightened, occasionally, surprised, sometimes, impressed, rarely. But awe, the genuine, overwhelming experience of encountering something that surpasses your framework for understanding the universe, that had never happened. The humans were the first thing that exceeded what I was built to comprehend, and my body, that brutally honest record keeper, was documenting every moment of the experience, in light and scar tissue. I sent a message to the directorate that night, a single line, appended to my preliminary tactical data. Previous classifications may require significant revision. I did not tell them about the light. I was not ready to explain what I did not yet fully understand. The convoy ambush came 3 days later, and it changed everything that remained to be changed. The battle group had been escorting a convoy of Sethkai evacuation transports through a cleared section of the corridor when a Dreth strike force that was supposed to have been neutralized hit us from a concealed position in an asteroid cluster. The attack was well coordinated and precisely targeted. They ignored the warships entirely, and drove straight for the medical transport at the center of the convoy, a converted freighter carrying 400 wounded HFY civilians, most of them children. I was on the Carthage's observation deck when the attack began, and I watched what happened next through the viewport with my own eyes, not through a tactical display, not through sensor data, but directly, the way you watch something that you need to remember in your body rather than your mind. 3 human escort ships broke formation and moved to intercept, but they did not maneuver to engage the Dreth attackers. They did not position themselves for optimal firing angles or defensive counter-battery. They flew directly between the Dreth weapons and the medical transport, and stopped. They used their own hulls as shields. The Dreth fire that was meant for the transport struck the escort ships instead, hammering their armor and shields with a sustained barrage that lit up the viewport in strobing flashes of impact and detonation. The frigate Callaway took a torpedo hit that blew out her port engine array, and instead of pulling away, her crew vented atmosphere from the damaged section to prevent a cascade failure and held position, drifting in the defensive gap, absorbing fire with a ship that could no longer maneuver, because moving would have exposed the transport behind them. I learned later that the crew in the vented sections had 60 seconds of warning before the atmosphere was pulled from their lungs. 60 seconds to seal their suits, grab hold of something solid, and accept that their ship had just become a wall between someone else's children and the weapons trying to reach them. Every single one of them stayed at their station. Not one person moved toward the escape pods that were cycling green on every console. Not one person questioned the order. They sealed their helmets and watched the air vanish through the breach and kept their ship exactly where it needed to be. Because 400 HFY civilians were breathing on the other side of that wall, and breathing mattered more than comfort. I pressed my hands against the viewport glass and felt scars forming across my palms. On the ground, the situation was equally desperate. Intelligence reported a Dreth raiding party advancing on a HFY settlement called Ketha Station, a small residential habitat housing roughly 600 civilians who had not yet been evacuated. The platoon I was embedded with received orders to reinforce. The distance was 17 hours of forced march through compromised corridors and unstable hull sections. Okafor did not hesitate. She looked at her platoon, soldiers who had been fighting for 3 consecutive days with minimal rest, and said, "Full pack. We move in 5. They marched for 17 hours. I marched with them because Lou marched, and my instructions were to follow Lou. My legs burned. My lungs ached. My species is not built for sustained physical endurance, and by the 12th hour, Lou was carrying my pack in addition to his own, without being asked, because he had noticed me falling behind, and had simply taken the weight from my shoulders without breaking stride. He did not mention it. He did not slow down. He simply absorbed the additional burden the way humans seem to absorb everything, as though their capacity for taking on weight, physical and otherwise, had no upper limit that anyone had yet discovered. By the 15th hour, soldiers were stumbling. I could see it in the way their steps shortened, and their shoulders curved forward, and their breathing became audible in the silence of the corridors. These were not machines, they were biological organisms, operating well past the point where their bodies wanted to stop. But they did not stop. They put one foot in front of the other with a grim, methodical stubbornness that defied fatigue, the way their combat doctrine defied numerical disadvantage, by refusing to acknowledge it as a relevant factor. We arrived at Ketha Station, exhausted, dehydrated, undersupplied, and outnumbered by the Dreth force that was already assembling for the assault. Okafor took one look at the tactical situation, turned to her platoon and said, "We go in now, before they are ready." A soldier whose name I did not catch, a young man with tired eyes and shaking hands, looked at the Dreth positions and said, "Sergeant, we have been marching for 17 hours. "I know," Okafor said, "so have they not been. We are tired. They are rested. That means they are expecting us to wait, so we do not wait." They attacked. 31 exhausted human soldiers attacked a prepared Dreth position, defended by over 100 warriors, and they won. Not cleanly, not easily, not without cost. But they won, because the Dreth did not expect an assault from a force that should have been incapable of fighting, and by the time they realized the humans were not operating on the same assumptions about what was possible, the defensive line had already been broken. The Dreth had calculated their safety margin based on the reasonable expectation that no organism could march for 17 hours and then immediately engage in high-intensity combat. The calculation was biologically sound. It accounted for every known variable of physical endurance across every documented species in the Galactic Index. It did not account for the fact that the humans had decided the calculation was irrelevant. I sat in the aftermath, surrounded by the 600 SciFi civilians who were alive because 31 humans had refused to be tired, and I sent my second message to the Directorate. My hands were shaking so badly that the text was barely legible. Previous classifications of human military capability are incorrect by orders of magnitude. Recommend immediate reclassification. Full details to follow. I am running out of skin. The final phase of the campaign began with intelligence that made the Directorate's previous assessment of human forces look like a children's guess at the weight of a star. Dreth warlord Kesavax had pulled his remaining forces back to a fortress station at the far end of the Thresh corridor, a massive, heavily armed installation built into an asteroid that had been hollowed out and reinforced over decades of occupation. The station was a military nightmare, bristling with weapons platforms, shielded by overlapping defense grids, and garrisoned by what remained of the warlord's personal guard, the best equipped and most fanatical Dreth fighters in the entire Calyx margin. Inside the station were 3,000 SciFi hostages. I sat in the command briefing and listened to the intelligence officer lay out the situation in the flat, factual tone that military professionals use when the facts are too terrible for emphasis. The hostages were being held in compartments distributed throughout the station's interior, positioned deliberately between defensive strongpoints. Living shields. Any assault on the fortress would have to fight through the Dreth garrison while simultaneously avoiding the hostage compartments, which meant operating under rules of engagement so restrictive that they effectively neutralized most of the humans' tactical advantages. Standard galactic doctrine for this situation is explicit and well-established. I had seen it applied by 6 different species across 3 different conflicts. You blockade the station, you open negotiations, you prepare for a protracted siege, and you accept, quietly and without saying it aloud, that a significant percentage of the hostages will not survive. The mathematics of hostage rescue against a fortified position are brutal and unforgiving, and every species I had observed had made the same calculation. The cost of a full assault exceeds the value of the hostages. Therefore, the hostages become a negotiating variable, rather than a rescue objective. Captain Danes stood at the front of the briefing room, and I watched his face as the intelligence officer finished. I had learned to read human expressions with increasing accuracy over the past 2 weeks, and what I saw in Dane's face was not calculation. It was not the careful weighing of costs against benefits that I had observed in 14 other species commanders when confronted with impossible odds. It was something quieter and more dangerous than that. It was decision. "We go in," he said. "Full assault. 6-vector simultaneous breach. Objective is complete hostage recovery. 0 acceptable casualties among the civilian population." The room was silent for 3 seconds. I counted them. 3 seconds during which every officer in that briefing room processed the magnitude of what their captain had just ordered. 0 civilian casualties. In a fortified station, against a garrison using living shields, with 3,000 hostages distributed across dozens of compartments. The mathematical improbability of that objective was not a matter of debate. It was a matter of physics, of geometry, of the hard limitations of what weapons and bodies could achieve in confined spaces against entrenched defenders who had specifically designed their defensive posture to make this exact outcome impossible. A lieutenant commander named Petra Voss, Dane's executive officer, leaned forward. "Captain, 0 civilian casualties against a fortified garrison using living shields. The statistical probability of achieving that objective is—" "I know the statistics," Dane said. "The statistics say it cannot be done, so we will do something the statistics do not account for." He looked around the room, meeting each officer's eyes in turn. "Every one of those hostages is someone. They have names. They have families. They are counting on someone to come for them, and we are the only ones who showed up. We do not get to fail them because the math says it is hard." I felt a scar form across the back of my neck, hot and sharp. and I did not reach for it. The assault on the fortress station was the most intense military operation I have witnessed in my career. It was the most intense military operation I expect to witness in whatever remains of my life. I say this, not with the clinical objectivity of a professional analyst, but with the raw, unfiltered honesty of someone whose body was burning with the evidence of what they saw. The attack commenced at zero dark, a human military term for the hour when night is deepest, which had no meaning in space but which the humans used anyway, because their language carried the weight of 1,000 years of warfare on a single world, and they brought that weight with them everywhere they went. 6 breach teams hit the fortress simultaneously from 6 different vectors. The coordination was so precise that the detonations of the 6 entry charges were audible as a single sound, one unified percussion that shook the station's superstructure and announced to every Dreth defender inside that something was coming for them. I was in the second wave, embedded with a rescue team whose specific objective was to reach a hostage compartment on the station's 4th level. The team leader was a lieutenant named Grace Harlow, a woman with pale eyes and a voice that never rose above a murmur, even when the corridor ahead of us erupted with Dreth weapons fire and the walls began to run with acid spray. The fighting inside the fortress was unlike anything in my catalog. The corridors were designed for Dreth physiology, narrow and branching, with blind corners and concealed alcoves that turned every meter of advance into a potential ambush. The Dreth defenders fought with the desperation of soldiers who knew they were cornered, and their knowledge of the station's layout gave them advantages that should have been insurmountable. The humans fought through them anyway. I watched human soldiers clear rooms that were essentially kill boxes, entering through doorways that funneled them into prepared fields of fire, absorbing casualties and continuing to advance, because stopping meant the hostages behind the next barrier would be executed before anyone could reach them. I watched fire teams leapfrog through intersections, while acid spray hissed past them, close enough that I could feel the heat of the chemical reaction on my skin. I watched a medic named Paul Hendricks drag a wounded soldier to cover while firing his sidearm with his free hand, treating the wound with one set of fingers while killing with the other, his face set in an expression of focused concentration that contained no fear whatsoever. Behind us, the sounds of battle echoed from every direction, a layered chorus of weapons fire and Dreth shrieks, and human voices calling out targets and positions and status reports in clipped, efficient phrases that wasted nothing and communicated everything. A corporal took a mandible slash across the thigh and kept moving. A private cleared a room with a grenade and followed it in before the smoke had settled. The pace was relentless, and the cost was visible in every corridor we passed through, in the human soldiers who had fallen and been pulled to the side by their squad mates, and marked with a beacon so the recovery teams would find them later. No one stopped for the fallen. There was no time. The hostages could not wait for grief. The rescue team reached the 4th level after 40 minutes of continuous fighting. Between us and the hostage compartment was a sealed blast door, 3 meters of reinforced alloy, designed to withstand a sustained naval bombardment. The only alternative route was a maintenance shaft that ran parallel to the main corridor, a tube barely wide enough for a human to crawl through, which our sensors indicated was occupied by at least a dozen Dreth defenders. Harlow assessed the situation in silence. The blast door would take 30 minutes to breach. In 30 minutes, the Dreth garrison would have time to execute hostages in other compartments, or to collapse the station's structure around us, or to bring reinforcements from the lower levels. A voice came from behind me. "I will go through the shaft." Sergeant Priya Vasant stepped forward. She was small, even by human standards, with dark hair pulled back tight, and steady hands that held her weapon the way a musician holds an instrument, with familiarity and respect and absolute confidence. Kess was beside me. She had been at my shoulder through the entire assault, a constant presence that I had stopped questioning and started relying on. She looked at Vasant, and I saw something pass between them, a communication that used no words and carried the weight of everything that did not need to be said. "She knows," Kess murmured, so quietly that I was not sure she intended me to hear. "Knows what?" I whispered. "She knows she is not coming back out." Vasant did not look afraid. She checked her weapon. She checked her sidearm. She checked the combat knife strapped to her thigh. She looked at Harlow, and Harlow looked back at her, and neither of them spoke, because the decision had already been made in a language older than words. Vasant entered the shaft. I heard the fighting from where I stood, the sharp cracks of her weapon echoing through the metal tube, each shot producing a ringing reverberation that made the walls vibrate against my palms. The shrieking of Dreth in close quarters, high and piercing, the sound of predators discovering that they were not the most dangerous thing in the dark. The wet, heavy sounds of a knife doing work that guns cannot do in a space too small to aim. There was a rhythm to it. Fire, silence, movement, fire again. Each pause shorter than the last, each burst of sound more desperate. She was advancing, meter by meter, through a tube full of armored insectoids with mandible blades. She was advancing, and they were dying, and each one that fell cleared the path for the team waiting behind her. It went on for 4 minutes. 4 minutes of sound that painted pictures I will carry in my skin forever. 4 minutes during which every member of the rescue team stood in absolute silence, listening, knowing exactly what those sounds meant and what they were costing. When the sounds stopped, the shaft was clear. The team breached through and found the hostage compartment, and 300 Sethkai civilians were alive behind the door, huddled in the dark, their wide, dark eyes reflecting the light that was pouring from every surface of my body. Vasant's body was recovered from the shaft afterward. She had killed 9 Dreth in a space so confined that she could not have raised her weapon above her waist. The last 3 she had fought with her knife alone. The battle continued around us, but the trajectory had been set. Every breach team was inside. Every hostage compartment was being reached. One by one, corridor by corridor, room by room. The cost was mounting. I could hear the casualty reports coming through Harlow's comm unit, names and numbers that blurred together into a grim arithmetic that would have broken the will of any force I had previously observed. The humans did not break. It was during the push toward the 6th-level compartments that I became separated from the rescue team. A Dreth counterattack collapsed a section of corridor between me and the main group, and I found myself alone in a darkened passage, with no weapon, no escort, and the sound of chittering movement growing closer from somewhere ahead. 3 Dreth emerged from a side corridor. They were not the garrison's best. They were wounded, disoriented, separated from their unit. But they were still Dreth, still armored, still armed with mandible blades and acid glands, and I was a Veshtari analyst with no combat training and a body that was glowing so brightly it served as a beacon for anything looking for a target. They saw me. They charged. I did not run, not because I was brave, because there was nowhere to run to. Kess came from behind them like something out of a combat manual that had not been written yet. She hit the first Dreth from the side, her sidearm firing at contact range into the gap between its head and thorax armor. It went down. The second turned toward her, mandible blades swinging, and she ducked under them with a reflexive economy of movement that cost her nothing and cost the Dreth its balance. Her knife found the nerve cluster beneath its forward leg joint, and it collapsed. The third caught her across the ribs. I heard the mandible blade connect. I heard the sound of bone cracking, a sharp, wet snap that filled the corridor like a hand clap. Kess staggered. She did not fall. She brought the knife up underhanded and drove it through the Dreth's eye cluster with a strength that should not have been possible from a body that had just absorbed a blow capable of shattering reinforced plating. The Dreth fell. Kess stood over it, breathing in short, ragged gasps, her left arm pressed against her side where the ribs had broken, blood running through her fingers in dark, steady streams. She turned to me. Her face was white with pain, and her eyes were sharp, and there was no fear in them whatsoever. "You are supposed to stay behind the line, cataloger," she said. I looked at her. I looked at the 3 dead Dreth on the floor. I looked at the blood on her hands, and the angle of her body, where the broken ribs were shifting beneath the skin, and every scar on my body blazed with a light so intense that the corridor turned white. "Kess," I said, "you need medical attention." After what? After we get you back to the team." She walked. Broken ribs, bleeding from a wound that should have dropped her, weapon in one hand and the other pressed against her side, she walked me back to the rescue team through 200 meters of compromised corridor, and she did not stop, and she did not falter. and when a Dreth scout emerged from a side passage and raised its weapon, she shot it without breaking stride. The fortress fell. The warlord's guard was destroyed. Every hostage compartment was reached. Every civilian was recovered. 3,000 Sethkai walked out of that fortress alive. 41 humans did not. I sat in the Carthage's medical bay afterward, glowing so brightly that the medical staff had to shade their instruments to get accurate readings. A human doctor examined me out of concern and found nothing physically wrong. My body was functioning normally. My vital signs were stable. The only abnormality was the light, which was pouring from my skin in dense, overlapping waves of bioluminescence that filled the bay like a blue sunrise. "Are you okay?" the doctor asked. "I do not know what I am anymore," I said. I went to see Kess. She was in the intensive unit, sedated and bandaged and alive, which I was told was a closer thing than anyone wanted to discuss in detail. 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, lacerations across her torso that had required 4 hours of surgery. She was conscious, barely, her eyes heavy with medication and pain, and when she saw me standing at the foot of her bed, glowing like a small star, she managed something that was almost a smile. "Revan, you are bright." I know. I stood there for a long time, looking at this human who had thrown herself between me and 3 armed Dreth, with nothing but a sidearm and a knife. I had spent my entire career maintaining professional distance. I had watched soldiers fight and die across 14 species, and had never once questioned the calculus, never once allowed the mathematics of observation to be contaminated by something as unprofessional as personal connection. "Why did you save me?" I asked. "I am an observer. I am not human. I am not crew. I am not tactically valuable." Kess looked at me through the haze of sedation, and her answer was simple and devastating, in the way that only truth can be. "You were there," she said. "That is enough." I left the medical bay and walked to the observation deck and stood in front of the viewport where I had first seen my reflection weeks ago, a lifetime ago, when I had been a different person with nearly unmarked skin and a professional certainty that the universe could be catalogued and classified and filed in neat, clinical categories. The person looking back at me from the dark glass was a constellation. Every visible surface of my skin was luminous with overlapping scars, each one a record of a moment when a human had done something that exceeded the boundaries of what my species believed was possible. My arms, my neck, my face, my hands. I was a walking archive of what it looked like when a species fought not for territory or resources or survival, but for the simple, staggering principle that suffering should be answered and strangers should be saved, and the only qualification required for protection was existence. I could never go back to what I had been. The observation had become the evidence, the analyst had become the archive, and the light my body was generating would not stop, because the things I had witnessed could not be unfelt, and the scars they had left would glow for the rest of my life. They dimmed every light in the chamber, and it still was not enough. I stood before the 7 members of the Strategic Directorate and watched them look at me, and I saw the fear in their translucent faces, and I understood it. I was not what they had sent out. I was something else now, something that their classification systems had no category for, and the light pouring from my skin was proof that their understanding of the galaxy was incomplete in ways that mattered. Director Halvin asked for my assessment. She asked for the clinical data, the tactical doctrine, the force projection capability, the threat classification, the neat, professional vocabulary that would allow 7 people in a dark room to file a report and move on to the next item on their agenda. I gave them the data first. I owed them that much. Fleet composition of the Terran Confederacy's Calyx Margin deployment, engagement statistics across 12 major and 31 minor actions, tactical innovation index, weapons capability assessment, logistical sustainability rating. I recited numbers and classifications and doctrinal analyses in the precise, clinical language that I had spent 19 cycles perfecting, and the panel nodded, and their aides took notes, and the data settled into the familiar grooves of institutional process. Then I stopped. "None of that is why I am standing here looking like this," I said. Halvin's stylus paused above her datapad. The room went still. "The tactical data is accurate. I continued. The force assessments are correct. You can file them and integrate them into your strategic models, and they will improve your predictions about human military behavior by a measurable margin. But they will not tell you what you need to know. They will not explain the light. I held up my hands. The scars on my palms blazed, each one a record of a moment when I had pressed my hands against a viewport and watched human ships use their own hulls to shield strangers. Each one a moment when I had gripped a datapad and tried to write down what I was seeing, and found that language was not built to hold it. You need to understand what humans are, I said. Not what they can do, what they are. Because the difference between those two things is the distance between your current classification and reality, and that distance will kill you if you do not close it. I told them about the Carthage, about the mess hall and the laughter, and the soldiers who were not afraid, not because they did not understand the danger, but because they had decided that fear was a problem to be managed, rather than a condition to be obeyed. I told them about Captain Dane, who looked at impossible odds the way most people look at weather, as something to be dressed for rather than fled from. I told them about the Thresh Corridor, about a fleet outnumbered 5-1 that charged directly into the teeth of a prepared defense, because their doctrine was built on the understanding that every other species fights to survive, and humans exploit that assumption by refusing to share it, about shield rotation patterns that treated 6 separate ships as a single organism, about closing to knife range because the enemy's mathematics did not account for an opponent who considered distance a disadvantage. I told them about Sethkai holding 7, about a corporal who knelt beside a dead child who was not his species, not his citizen, not his concern by any strategic calculation, and made a promise to that child's body that the people responsible would be found. About Kess's explanation of bearing witness, the human belief that seeing suffering makes you responsible for answering it. I told them about Private Kalu, who took an acid hit that dissolved through his armor and into his shoulder, and shifted his weapon to the other hand and kept fighting, and when the medic reached him said it just stung a little. I told them about a platoon that marched for 17 hours without rest and attacked a superior force at the end of it, because their sergeant decided that the enemy would not expect them to be capable of fighting, and the sergeant was right. I told them about the convoy ambush, about 3 escort ships that flew between incoming fire and a medical transport full of wounded children and used their own bodies as barriers, about the frigate Callaway, whose crew vented their own atmosphere to prevent an explosion because exploding would have meant moving, and moving would have exposed the ship they were protecting, about a crew who chose to breathe vacuum rather than abandon strangers. I told them about Sergeant Vassant, who entered a maintenance shaft knowing she would not emerge from the other end, who fought 9 Dreth in a space too small to stand in, and killed them all so that 300 hostages could be reached. About the 4 minutes of sound that I would carry in my scars for the rest of my life. I told them about Kess, about a lieutenant who put herself between an alien observer and 3 armed Dreth with a sidearm and a knife and a set of ribs that shattered under the impact, and lungs that filled with blood, and eyes that contained no fear, about being asked why, and hearing the answer that would redefine everything I thought I understood about the relationship between sacrifice and value. You were there. That is enough. The chamber was silent when I finished. 7 members of the Strategic Directorate sat in their curved seats, and their translucent skin was dark and unmarked, and the only light in the room was mine. Director Halvin spoke first. Her voice was careful, the way you handle something fragile that you are not certain will survive being held. Senior Cataloger Sol, based on your assessment, do you recommend classifying humans as a strategic threat? No, I said. I recommend classifying them as a strategic inevitability. The word hung in the air. I watched it land on each of them in turn, watched their faces shift as the implications unfolded. Every species in known space fights to protect what it has, I said. Territory, resources, population, strategic advantage, the things that can be counted and measured and traded and lost. These are rational motivations, and they produce rational behavior. And rational behavior can be predicted, and predicted behavior can be defeated. This is the foundation of every strategic model the Directorate has ever built. You assume that your adversary wants to preserve something, and you threaten that thing, and they calculate the cost of resistance against the cost of concession, and the engagement resolves along predictable lines. I paused. Let the silence do its work. Humans fight to protect what they believe in, and beliefs cannot be counted, they cannot be measured, they cannot be traded or threatened or destroyed by conventional means. A belief does not diminish when you attack it. It does not weaken when you inflict casualties on the people who hold it. It does not surrender when you surround it. And that distinction is not a tactical variable that you can model. It is a fundamental difference in the architecture of motivation that changes every calculation you will ever make about them. I stepped closer to the panel's table. The light from my skin painted their faces in shifting blue. You can take territory from a species that fights for territory. You can destroy the fleet of a species that fights to preserve its fleet. You can burn the worlds of a species that fights to protect its worlds. These are solvable problems. Every conflict you have ever modeled is built on the assumption that the enemy has something to lose and will behave rationally to avoid losing it. I held their eyes. Humans do not have something to lose. They have something to believe. And you cannot take a belief from a human. You can only make them believe it harder. Every battle they fight, every sacrifice they make, every soldier they lose, strengthens the thing that drives them, rather than weakening it. They are the only species I have observed that becomes more dangerous the more you hurt them. Because pain does not teach them to retreat. Pain teaches them that the thing they are fighting for was worth the cost. A member of the panel named Director Saith, who oversaw threat assessment for the eastern sectors, leaned forward. His voice was quiet. What happens when a species like that encounters a species like ours? What is the outcome? There are two outcomes, I said. You become their ally, or you become their example. Every species that encounters humans in combat will be sorted into one of those two categories. There is no third option. There is no neutral ground. Because humans do not recognize the concept of a fight that does not matter. If they are there, the fight matters. If the fight matters, they will not stop. And if they will not stop, then the only variable is whether you are standing beside them or in front of them. The room absorbed this. I watched 7 senior officials of the Veshtari Strategic Directorate sit with the realization that their understanding of military capability had been incomplete for as long as they had been aware of humanity, and that the gap between their models and reality was not a margin of error, but a chasm. Director Halvin set down her stylus. Your scars, she said. The medical division has reviewed your preliminary bioscan. They indicate that the bioluminescent scarring can be treated. The marks can be faded, potentially eliminated entirely. Given the extent of the scarring and its impact on your professional capacity, the Directorate is prepared to authorize immediate treatment. I looked at her. I looked at the panel. I looked at my hands, burning with the light of everything I had witnessed, every moment of impossible courage and irrational sacrifice, and terrifying, beautiful commitment to a principle that most species could not even articulate, let alone die for. No, I said. Halvin blinked. Cataloger Soul, the scarring is extensive. It will impede your ability to embed with future forces. Your luminescence alone would compromise observational neutrality in any tactical environment. I understand. Then you understand that declining treatment effectively ends your career as a tactical cataloger. I understand that as well. I held up my hands, palms out, and let the light fill the chamber. Every scar visible, every mark burning with its own record. The map of human combat written on my body, in a language that required no translation and permitted no misunderstanding. These scars are the most honest report I will ever file, I said. Every analyst you send after me will come back with words. Words can be edited. Words can be softened. Words can be filed and forgotten and buried, under the next briefing cycle, and the cycle after that, until the urgency fades and the data becomes just another entry in a database that nobody reads. I came back with proof. I came back as living evidence that there exists in this galaxy a species that fights with a conviction so absolute that witnessing it permanently alters the biology of anyone who stands close enough to see it. And you want me to erase that? I lowered my hands. No. Every time a member of the Directorate looks at me and sees these scars, they will remember what humans are capable of. Every time a junior analyst passes me in a corridor and asks what happened, I will tell them. And every time someone suggests that humans are a Tier 6 species with unremarkable capabilities and a compact territorial holding, my skin will call them a liar. Halvin held my gaze for a long time. Then she nodded, once, and deactivated the recording device. "This hearing is concluded," she said. "Cataloger Soul's assessment will be integrated into strategic planning at the highest classification level. The human military reclassification will proceed as recommended." I turned and walked toward the chamber door. As it opened, the light from my body spilled into the corridor beyond, and I saw 2 junior catalogers waiting in the passage, fresh-faced and unmarked, their translucent skin carrying the professional cleanliness of analysts who had not yet been sent to see anything that would leave a trace. One of them stared at me, at the rivers of light that covered my arms and climbed my neck and crossed my face, at the glow that filled the corridor and pushed the shadows back against the walls. "Senior cataloger," she said. Her voice was careful, respectful, and underneath the respect, undeniably fascinated. "What species did that to you?" I looked at her. I considered the clinical answer. Species designation: human. Terran Confederacy. Previously classified Tier 6. Territory in Sector 7. Fleet composition: modest. Technological capability: unremarkable. None of that was the answer. "Humans," I said. She looked at the light pouring from my scars, at the density and brightness and sheer impossible volume of marks covering my body, and she asked the question that I had been waiting to answer since I walked off the Carthage for the last time. "Are they dangerous?" I thought about Dane, who looked at impossible odds and saw a math problem to be solved differently. I thought about Kalu, who fought one-handed with acid eating through his shoulder because the fight was not finished yet. I thought about Okafor, who marched her platoon for 17 hours and attacked at the end because waiting was not an option when lives were counting the minutes. I thought about the crew of the Callaway, who breathed vacuum rather than move. I thought about Vasant, who walked into a shaft she would never walk out of, so that strangers could walk out of a prison. I thought about Eddie Grant, who made a promise to a dead child he had never met. I thought about Kess, broken ribs, punctured lung, blood on her hands, no fear in her eyes. "You were there. That is enough." I looked at the young cataloger with her unmarked skin and her clean professional record and her tidy, unchallenged model of how the galaxy works, and I gave her the only answer that was true. "They are the only species I have ever observed that made me stop observing and start believing." I walked away. The corridor behind me glowed faintly in my wake, pale blue and persistent, the after-image of a body that had been marked by something it could not classify and would not erase and did not want to forget. Somewhere in the calyx margin, a fleet of compact, unremarkable ships, crewed by a mid-tier species with modest technology and limited territory, was fighting another battle for people they had never met. Somewhere, a soldier was making a promise to a stranger. Somewhere, a lieutenant was putting herself between danger and someone who needed protection, for no other reason than that they were there and she could act, and choosing not to act was a wound she refused to carry. And on a Veshtari diplomatic station, far from the fighting, an analyst walked through quiet corridors, burning with a light that would never go out, carrying in her skin the most honest report ever filed. Living evidence. Permanent. Luminous. True.